I found out my wedding had been cancelled the same way I'd found out about most life-altering decisions in my family, accidentally, and far too late for my opinion to matter. It was a quiet Tuesday morning when my phone buzzed with a notification from the venue coordinator, a polite message that began with "per our conversation with your family." I remember rereading that line several times, my brain lagging behind the meaning of the words. My family? Conversation? Cancellation? I was standing in my kitchen, barefoot on cold tile, the kettle screaming on the stove while my world quietly shifted on its axis. By the time I reached the end of the message, confirming that the wedding date had been released and all preparations paused, I was gripping the counter so tightly my knuckles had gone white, my heart pounding not with panic yet, but with something colder and far more familiar. What happened next was rather unexpected. I will tell you everything, but first, if you enjoy stories like this, you want to be part of the 10% viewers who click on the like button. It makes us really happy. If you are yet to subscribe to our channel, kindly support us today by subscribing to this channel. This helps us to bring you more beautiful stories. It will be great to tell us where you are watching us from in the comment section. At first, I assumed it had to be a mistake, some crossed wires or clerical error that could be cleared up with a single phone call. That was the rational explanation, the one that let me breathe for a few seconds longer before the truth began creeping in. My family had always been involved. Involved in my choices, my timing, my relationships, my finances. They had a habit of stepping in whenever they believed I was making a mistake, especially when those mistakes involved independence. The idea that they might have called the venue without telling me felt outrageous, even by their standards, yet as I stood there staring at my phone, memory after memory surfaced, times they'd spoken for me, decided for me, reassured others that they'd handle it. The kettle boiled dry behind me, but I didn't move. I already knew, deep down, that this wasn't an error. I called my mother first, because she was always the spokesperson when difficult decisions were made as a family. She didn't answer right away, and that silence told me more than words ever could. When she finally picked up, her voice was calm, almost relieved, like someone who'd been waiting for an inevitable conversation. I didn't even ask what had happened at first. I simply said, "Why did the venue cancel my wedding?" There was a pause on the line, just long enough for her to choose the tone she wanted to use. "We thought it would be better this way," she said gently, as if explaining a delayed appointment rather than dismantling months of planning and hope. She went on to explain that everyone had been worried about me, about how fast things were moving, about whether I was truly ready. She said they'd talked it through, weighed the options, and come to a decision for my own good. Those words landed like a slap, not because they were new, but because of how often they'd been used to justify stripping me of agency. For my own good. As if adulthood were something I'd never quite earned. As if love required a committee's approval. I asked her why no one had bothered to talk to me before making that call, and she sighed, telling me they didn't want to stress me out or make things harder. The irony was so sharp I almost laughed. By the time I hung up, my hands were shaking. Not from shock, but from the quiet rage of being infantilized yet again. I called my sister next, hoping, foolishly, that she might have opposed the idea or at least warned me. Instead, she sounded defensive, insisting that they were only trying to protect me from making a mistake I'd regret. She reminded me of past relationships that hadn't worked out, of moments when I'd struggled, as if my entire adult life were a case study in poor judgment. "We just don't think you see things clearly right now," she said, and I realized then that in their eyes, clarity was something granted, not claimed. What none of them seemed to grasp, or perhaps what they assumed I would never push back on, was the sheer audacity of canceling a wedding that wasn't theirs to cancel. This wasn't just an opinion or a boundary crossed. This was action taken behind my back, phone calls made, authority assumed. As the hours passed, messages started coming in from extended family members expressing sympathy, some of them awkwardly worded, others outright patronizing. A cousin told me it was probably for the best, while an aunt said she admired how mature I was being about it, as if my silence were consent rather than disbelief. With every message, my chest tightened further, the sense of betrayal deepening into something heavier and harder to ignore. That evening, I sat alone in my living room, staring at the wedding binder I'd spent months curating, color swatches, seating charts, handwritten notes about vows and timing. It felt surreal to hold something so carefully planned while being told it no longer existed. I thought about my partner, who was out of town for work and hadn't even heard the news yet, and about how I would explain this without sounding like a child whose parents had confiscated a toy. The humiliation burned hotter than the anger. Not because the wedding was cancelled, but because it had been taken from me under the guise of love. Eventually, I opened my laptop and pulled up the venue's contract, more out of habit than intention. I'd reviewed it dozens of times during planning, negotiated details personally, insisted on clarity where my family thought I was being difficult. As I scrolled through the pages now, my eyes skimmed familiar clauses until they landed on the signature section. My name was there, bold and unmistakable, listed not just as the client, but as the registered owner of the property. I stopped breathing for a moment, the reality settling in slowly, almost gently. The venue wasn't just booked under my name. It belonged to me. Had belonged to me for years, quietly folded into an investment portfolio my family had never bothered to ask about because they'd assumed it wasn't theirs to know. In that moment, something shifted inside me, not triumph, not vengeance, but clarity. They had made their move based on an assumption they'd always relied on, that I needed their permission, their approval, their oversight. They believed canceling my wedding would teach me something, that it would steer me back into compliance. What they didn't know was that they'd just handed me a moment of truth so undeniable it left no room for doubt. The venue coordinator's message wasn't a loss. It was an opening. I closed the laptop slowly and leaned back, the anger in my chest cooling into resolve. I wasn't going to shout or plead or demand explanations anymore. I wasn't going to beg them to respect my choices or recognize my adulthood. They had already made their decision. Now it was my turn to respond. Not with arguments, but with facts. And when the time came, when they realized whose signature actually mattered, whose authority they had so casually ignored, they would understand something they never had before. They hadn't cancelled my wedding. They'd simply revealed how little they knew about me. The next morning, I woke up with the kind of clarity that only comes after a long night of sitting with uncomfortable truths. There was no frantic urge to fix things, no impulse to call everyone back and argue my case. That stage had passed quietly sometime in the early hours, replaced by something steadier and far more dangerous to people like my family, certainty. I made coffee, opened my laptop again, and reread the contract in full, not because I doubted what I'd seen the night before, but because I wanted to ground myself in facts before emotions had a chance to interfere. The venue wasn't just mine in a casual sense. I was the sole legal owner. I had purchased it years earlier through a holding company, signed every document myself, paid every tax bill myself. The authority they thought they'd exercised didn't exist. I called the venue coordinator next, the same woman who had sent the cancellation message. Her voice carried immediate relief when she realized I wasn't calling to yell. I asked her, calmly, to walk me through exactly who had contacted her and what they had said. She hesitated at first, choosing her words carefully, then explained that my mother and sister had called together, presenting themselves as representatives acting in my best interest. They had sounded confident, she said, insistent but polite, explaining that the wedding needed to be postponed indefinitely due to concerns about the bride's emotional readiness. Hearing that phrase out loud made something twist sharply in my chest, but I kept my voice level. I thanked her for the transparency and asked one final question: had she verified their authority to cancel? There was a pause before she admitted she had assumed it was legitimate because of their certainty and the family framing. Assumptions, I thought, were powerful things. I told her there would be no cancellation and asked her to reinstate the date immediately. When she hesitated, explaining that the date had already been released back into availability, I smiled despite myself. That won't be a problem, I said. You're speaking with the owner. The silence on the other end of the line was immediate and profound. She apologized repeatedly, clearly flustered, and assured me she would correct the situation at once. When the call ended, I sat back and let the moment settle. For the first time since this began, I felt something close to satisfaction, not because I'd outmaneuvered anyone, but because I'd reclaimed something that had always been mine. I didn't call my family right away. I knew better. They were used to controlling the timing of conversations, to setting narratives before others could respond. Instead, I waited. And as expected, it didn't take long. My mother called me mid-afternoon, her tone brisk, edged with irritation. She wasn't bothering to soften anymore. She demanded to know why the venue coordinator had contacted her with conflicting information. I let her talk, listening as she framed the issue as a misunderstanding caused by poor communication. When she finally paused, waiting for me to apologize or explain myself, I said only one sentence. "You can't cancel something you don't own." The line went quiet. When she spoke again, her voice had lost its certainty. She asked what I meant, as if the concept itself were foreign. I told her plainly that I owned the venue, that the contract had been signed by me, and that any decision regarding its use was mine alone. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse. I stated facts. She laughed nervously at first, dismissing it as a misunderstanding, then stopped laughing altogether when I didn't join her. "That's not funny," she said sharply. "Why would you keep something like that from us?" The question revealed more than she intended. Ownership, in her mind, was something I was expected to disclose, to seek approval for. My independence was acceptable only when it remained invisible. By the time I ended the call, messages had already begun appearing in the family group chat. My sister accused me of being deceptive, of deliberately hiding information that affected everyone. An uncle chimed in, suggesting I'd escalated the situation unnecessarily. Even my father weighed in, saying nothing directly accusatory but implying that secrecy eroded trust. I read each message carefully, noting how quickly responsibility had shifted. They hadn't cancelled my wedding anymore. I had forced them into an awkward position. The inversion was almost impressive. Instead of defending myself, I typed a single response: "My wedding is back on. The venue decision was never yours to make." Then I muted the chat. That evening, my partner called. I told them everything, from the cancellation to the ownership reveal, my voice steady even as the weight of it all pressed down. They were quiet for a long time, then said something that stayed with me. "They didn't do this because they don't trust you," they said. "They did it because they don't respect you." Hearing it framed that way hurt more than I expected, but it also clarified what I needed to do next. This wasn't about salvaging family harmony. It was about drawing a line so clear it couldn't be blurred again. The next day, I received an email from the venue's legal department confirming the reinstatement of the date and outlining steps to prevent unauthorized interference in the future. I forwarded it to my family without commentary. The silence that followed was deafening. No one responded for hours. When my sister finally did, her message was short and clipped, accusing me of humiliating them publicly. I almost replied, then stopped. The humiliation hadn't come from exposure. It had come from assumption. They had assumed control where none existed, authority where none was granted. Reality had simply corrected them. As the week went on, the tone shifted again. Calls became tentative. Messages softened. My mother suggested we reset and talk things through like adults, a phrase that would have been laughable if it hadn't been so revealing. My father asked to meet in person, framing it as concern rather than confrontation. I agreed, but only on my terms, only when I felt ready. For the first time, I wasn't negotiating access to my own life. I was offering it conditionally. Late one night, as I reviewed the updated wedding plans, I realized something quietly profound. The venue had always been mine, but I'd never used that ownership as a shield or a weapon. I hadn't needed to. The real power wasn't in the deed or the contract. It was in my refusal to be overruled again. They had cancelled my wedding for my own good, believing I would fold, retreat, comply. Instead, they had exposed the limits of their influence. And they still didn't understand the most important part. Owning the venue wasn't the twist. Standing my ground was. The meeting with my parents happened 3 days later, not at their house and not at mine, but at a quiet restaurant they chose because it was neutral. I recognized the tactic immediately. Neutral ground, in their language, meant a place where no one technically had authority, which they assumed would restore the hierarchy they were comfortable with. I arrived early on purpose, choosing a table near the window where the light was good and the seating arrangement didn't force me into a corner. As I waited, I noticed how calm I felt, not numb or detached, but settled, as if something fundamental had aligned inside me. For years, I'd walked into conversations with them already braced for correction. This time, I wasn't bracing for anything. I was simply present. My parents arrived together, my mother first, scanning the room with an expression that mixed concern and irritation, my father a step behind her, composed but alert. They greeted me with restrained warmth, the kind that signals an agenda waiting just beneath the surface. We ordered drinks, exchanged small talk, and for a few minutes pretended this was an ordinary family meeting. But the pretense didn't last. My mother leaned forward, hands folded tightly, and said she wanted to clear the air before things got any more complicated. I nodded, inviting her to continue without offering reassurance. She began by repeating the familiar refrain. That they'd acted out of love, that they'd been worried about me, that canceling the wedding had never been meant as punishment or control. She spoke carefully, choosing words that framed their actions as protective rather than intrusive, hoping I'd accept the narrative and meet her halfway. When she finished, my father spoke next, his voice lower, steadier, carrying the weight of authority he was used to wielding. He said he was disappointed that I'd handled things the way I did, that involving contracts and ownership had escalated the situation unnecessarily. He told me families shouldn't resolve disagreements through power plays, a phrase that almost made me smile. For him to call my assertion of legal reality a power play revealed how deeply he believed authority should flow in one direction only. I listened to both of them without interrupting, letting their explanations settle in the space between us. When they finally stopped talking, the silence that followed was deliberate, expectant. They were waiting for me to soften. I want to be very clear, I said, my voice calm, measured, unshaken. You didn't make a mistake. You made a decision. And you made it without me. My mother opened her mouth to object, but I raised a hand gently, not to silence her, but to signal that I wasn't finished. I explained that canceling my wedding wasn't a misunderstanding or a miscommunication. It was an assumption that they had the right to intervene, to override my choices, because they believed they knew better. I told them that assumption was the real issue, not the venue, not the contract, not the embarrassment that followed. The words didn't come from anger. They came from clarity. My father shifted in his chair, his jaw tightening. He asked why I'd never told them I owned the venue, as if transparency on my part might have justified their interference. I met his gaze and answered honestly. I said I hadn't told them because I'd never felt the need to justify my independence, and because in my experience, information in this family was often used as leverage rather than understanding. The statement landed heavily. My mother looked away, her lips pressed together, while my father's expression hardened into something defensive. He accused me of distrusting them, of assuming bad intentions. I didn't deny it. I told him trust had to be earned, and that respect didn't grow from unilateral decisions made behind someone's back. The conversation shifted then, away from explanations and toward consequences. I told them the wedding would go forward as planned, at the venue, on the date we'd chosen. I said their presence was welcome, but not mandatory, and that I wouldn't negotiate my marriage or my adulthood anymore. My mother's eyes filled with tears, and she said I was being unfair, that I was punishing them for caring. My father said nothing, but the way he leaned back in his chair told me he was recalculating, weighing what he could still influence. The old dynamic flickered, searching for footing. It didn't find any. What surprised me most wasn't their resistance, but my own lack of fear. In the past, setting boundaries with them felt like risking exile. Now, it felt like stating a fact of geography. This is where I stand. You can meet me here, or you can stay where you are. When the check arrived, my father reached for it automatically, then hesitated, glancing at me as if to assert one last familiar role. I thanked him and paid myself. It was a small gesture, but it mattered. I watched him register it, another quiet correction to expectations he hadn't realized he still held. In the days that followed, the fallout rippled outward. Some relatives called to ask what really happened, their curiosity sharpened by the absence of a unified family story. Others stayed silent, unsure which side of the line they occupied. My sister oscillated between defensiveness and apology, clearly struggling to reconcile the version of me she'd known with the one now standing firm. I didn't push her either way. People adjust at their own pace, and some never do. I focused instead on the wedding preparations, meeting with coordinators, finalizing details, choosing things simply because I liked them, not because they would appease anyone else. One afternoon, while reviewing seating arrangements, I realized something that made me pause. For the first time, I wasn't designing an event around minimizing conflict. I wasn't spacing relatives apart to avoid arguments or softening choices to prevent criticism. I was planning a celebration that reflected who I was and who I was becoming. The venue, once just an investment, now felt symbolic, not because I owned it, but because it represented the space I'd claimed for myself. A space where decisions weren't overridden, where consent mattered, where adulthood wasn't conditional. The night before the final confirmations were due, my mother sent me a long message. She apologized, not fully, not without qualification, but enough to acknowledge that canceling the wedding had crossed a line. She said she was afraid of losing me, afraid of change, afraid of making the wrong call and watching me get hurt. I read the message twice, feeling the weight of it without letting it pull me backward. I replied with gratitude for the honesty and reiterated the boundary I'd already set. Fear doesn't justify control. Love doesn't require permission slips. As I turned off my phone and sat in the quiet of my living room, I thought about how easily this story could have gone another way. If I hadn't owned the venue. If I'd doubted myself. If I'd rushed to smooth things over instead of standing still long enough to see the truth. The realization didn't make me feel lucky. It made me feel resolved. Independence isn't something you announce. It's something you demonstrate, often quietly, often once, and then never again. They had cancelled my wedding for my own good, believing I would accept it as care. What they hadn't understood was that care without consent is just control by another name. The week before the wedding arrived with an almost eerie calm, the kind that settles in after a storm when the air feels too still to be trusted. Final confirmations rolled in, vendors checked schedules, and the venue, my venue, began to transform in ways I'd envisioned long before any of this conflict existed. Florists walked the grounds with quiet confidence, chairs were measured and remeasured, and the coordinator moved through it all with a new, careful respect that hadn't been there before. I noticed it in the way she asked questions now, in how she waited for my approval instead of assuming it would come from someone else. Authority, once clarified, has a way of simplifying things. I felt it settling into place, not loudly, but firmly, like a foundation you don't think about until you realize how much rests on it. My parents, on the other hand, seemed unsure how to occupy the days leading up to the event. Their calls became infrequent but heavier, each one carrying an undercurrent of uncertainty. My mother asked logistical questions she'd already asked before, as if participation in details might restore some sense of involvement. My father limited himself to brief check-ins, his tone neutral, almost formal, like someone navigating unfamiliar territory. I could tell they were struggling to recalibrate, to understand where they fit now that decisions weren't filtering through them by default. I didn't rush to fill that gap for them. This wasn't a punishment. It was a recalibration they needed to experience fully in order to understand. 2 days before the wedding, I received an email from the venue's administrative office confirming the final guest list and access permissions. I stared at the screen for a long moment, my cursor hovering over a single line, authorized contacts. My name was listed first, followed by my partner's. No one else. I hadn't requested the exclusion explicitly, it was simply how ownership worked. Still, the clarity of it struck me. This was the first major family event where my parents were not the default point of contact, not the arbiters of information, not the gatekeepers of access. They were, in the most literal sense, guests. The realization came into sharp focus the morning of the rehearsal. We gathered at the venue under a soft sky, the kind that promised good weather without demanding gratitude. My parents arrived early, as they always did, scanning the space with practiced familiarity. I watched from a distance as my mother approached the coordinator with questions, only to be gently redirected back to me. It wasn't dramatic. There were no raised voices or confrontations. Just a quiet, consistent shift in gravity. My father noticed it almost immediately. I saw the flicker of surprise cross his face when his usual nods of authority went unanswered, replaced by polite smiles and referrals back to the schedule I approved. He approached me during a lull, his hands clasped behind his back, his posture composed but tentative. "Everything looks well organized," he said, as if organization itself were something to be evaluated. I thanked him and waited, sensing there was more he wanted to say. After a pause, he added, "The staff seems very attentive." I met his gaze evenly. "They are," I replied. "It's their job." The words weren't sharp, but they landed with unmistakable finality. He nodded slowly, absorbing the implication, and stepped back without further comment. The rehearsal itself went smoothly. Friends laughed, family members found their places, and my partner squeezed my hand with quiet reassurance. I felt grounded in a way I hadn't expected, not buoyed by excitement so much as steadied by alignment. This was happening on my terms, in my space, with my voice setting the rhythm. When it ended, my parents lingered, uncertain whether to stay or leave. My mother offered a tentative hug, her arms tight, her body language betraying a mix of pride and discomfort. "It's beautiful," she said softly. I thanked her again, accepting the moment without letting it rewrite the past. That evening, alone in the venue after everyone had left, I walked the grounds slowly, taking in the details. The lights strung just right, the tables set where I'd imagined them, the quiet hum of readiness in the air. I thought about how close this all had come to being taken away, not by circumstance, but by presumption. If I hadn't owned the venue, if I hadn't stood firm, this space would have been just another thing I was told I'd lost for my own good. The thought didn't make me bitter. It made me grateful for the version of myself that had chosen not to shrink. The wedding day arrived without drama. The sun rose on schedule, the weather held, and the venue filled with people who came to celebrate, not control. My parents arrived dressed impeccably, their expressions composed, their behavior careful. They followed the seating chart without complaint, waited for cues instead of giving them, and watched as the day unfolded without their intervention. I could feel their awareness of it, the subtle restraint, the effort it took to let go. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress, and I recognized it for what it was without mistaking it for absolution. During the reception, my father approached me again, this time with a glass raised in tentative acknowledgement. "You did well," he said, the words sounding almost unfamiliar coming from him without qualification. I nodded, accepting the sentiment without the old hunger for approval. "Thank you," I replied, meaning it in the present tense, not as a repair of the past. He lingered for a moment, then added quietly, "I suppose I underestimated you." The admission was small, imperfect, but real. I let it stand without responding, allowing it to exist without negotiation. As the evening wore on, laughter filled the space, music carried across the grounds, and the venue pulsed with a life I'd chosen. I danced, I toasted, I watched people I loved interact freely, no longer arranged to prevent friction but allowed to be themselves. At one point, I caught my mother watching me from across the room, her expression thoughtful, perhaps even a little odd. I met her eyes and smiled, not to reassure her, not to seek validation, but simply because I was happy. The difference mattered. When the night finally wound down and guests began to leave, my parents thanked me for the invitation. The phrasing struck me then, gentle but unmistakable. Not for letting us help, not for including us, but for the invitation. I realized that this was the quiet resolution I'd been moving toward all along. Not dominance. Not revenge. But a redefinition of roles so clear it required no enforcement. They had cancelled my wedding for my own good, believing authority gave them the right to decide. Standing in the space I owned, surrounded by choices I'd made and people who respected them, I understood the truth they could no longer avoid. I was not a child to be managed. I was the host. The morning after the wedding felt strangely quiet, not in the empty way that follows a celebration ending, but in the settled way that comes after something has finally aligned. I woke up late, sunlight spilling across the floor of my bedroom, and for a moment I simply lay there, listening to the distant sounds of staff beginning cleanup at the venue. Normally, after a major family event, I would wake with a knot in my stomach, replaying conversations, worrying about who had been offended, who felt sidelined, who would reinterpret the day to fit their preferred narrative. This time, there was none of that. The silence felt earned. The day had unfolded exactly as it should have, without interference, without correction, without anyone stepping in to fix me or my choices. As messages started coming in from guests, a pattern emerged almost immediately. People commented on how personal the ceremony felt, how intentional every detail was, how grounded and confident I seemed. A friend told me she'd never been to a wedding that felt so unapologetically true to the couple hosting it. Another said she could tell I'd planned everything with care, not obligation. Each message reinforced something I hadn't fully articulated yet. The success of the day had nothing to do with my family's involvement. In fact, it had succeeded precisely because their control had been absent. That realization didn't make me resentful. It made me protective of the life I was building. My parents reached out later that afternoon, separately, their messages polite and carefully worded. My mother thanked me for allowing the day to proceed as it did, a phrase that revealed more than she intended. My father congratulated us and said he was proud, but stopped short of claiming any role in how things had turned out. In the past, he would have found a way to frame the event as a reflection of his guidance, his standards, his influence. This time, there was no plausible way to do that. The venue, the planning, the decisions, it was all undeniably mine. And for once, there was no angle from which they could rewrite the story without sounding absurd. In the weeks that followed, the shift became more pronounced. Family gatherings felt different, quieter in a way that was both awkward and honest. My parents no longer spoke for me or about me as though I weren't present. When discussions turned to plans or opinions, they paused, waited, sometimes even asked. It wasn't seamless or comfortable, but it was real. The old assumption, that they knew better by default, had been disrupted, and there was no easy way to restore it without revisiting the moment it broke. They avoided that moment carefully, as people do when they know an explanation would expose more than they're ready to admit. One evening, a few weeks after the wedding, my mother came by unannounced. In the past, that would have sent me into a quiet panic, scrambling to prepare myself for whatever concern or correction she was bringing with her. This time, I simply opened the door and invited her in. She sat at my kitchen table, looking around as if seeing the space differently now, not as an extension of the family domain, but as mine. She told me she'd been thinking a lot about the wedding, about how things had gone, about how she'd underestimated me. The admission was hesitant, imperfect, but sincere enough to matter. She said something then that stayed with me. "I think we got used to deciding things for you," she said quietly. "And we told ourselves it was love." The honesty caught me off guard. I nodded, not to absolve her, but to acknowledge the truth of it. Love without consent, I realized, isn't protection. It's possession dressed up as care. And possession doesn't let go easily, even when confronted with evidence that it should. We sat with that understanding for a while, neither of us rushing to smooth it over. What surprised me most wasn't their gradual adjustment, though. It was my own. I no longer felt the urge to prove myself, to justify my decisions with achievements or assets or hidden ownerships. The venue had served its purpose as a mirror, reflecting back a truth my family could no longer ignore. But I didn't need it as armor anymore. My confidence no longer came from what I could reveal to silence them. It came from knowing I didn't owe them explanations to begin with. There were moments, of course, when the old dynamics tried to resurface. A suggestion framed as advice. A question loaded with expectation. But each time I responded calmly, consistently, without apology. The repetition did its work. Boundaries, I learned, aren't established by confrontation alone. They're maintained by behavior. And once people realize you won't bend, they either adapt or drift. Either outcome is survivable. Looking back, I understood that canceling my wedding hadn't been the betrayal. The betrayal was the assumption beneath it. That my life was still something they could rearrange when it made them uncomfortable. Owning the venue hadn't just exposed that assumption, it had dismantled it. Not through drama, not through revenge, but through clarity. They had acted based on a version of me that no longer existed. And instead of shrinking to fit their expectations, I had simply stood where I was. On a quiet evening, months later, I walked through the venue alone again, the space empty and peaceful. Weddings had come and gone since mine, each one leaving behind echoes of celebration and choice. I paused in the spot where I'd stood on my wedding day, remembering how steady I'd felt, how certain. That certainty hadn't faded. It had grown. I realized then that the most powerful part of the story wasn't the reveal, or the shock, or even the reversal of control. It was the moment I stopped asking for permission to live my own life. They canceled my wedding for my own good, believing they knew what was best for me. What they never expected was that, in doing so, they would lose the right to decide anything for me ever again. If you enjoy stories like this, you want to be part of the 10% viewers who click on the like button. It makes us really happy. If you are yet to subscribe to our channel, kindly support us today by subscribing to this channel. This helps us to bring you more beautiful stories.